to add to our understanding of humanism is my dear colleague, Joe Chuman, who was also my mentor when I was a leader in training. And I can't overstress how important having a caring mentor is. Because you're coming into this, I know James is new to this program, and it's so important to have an ally, to have someone who supports you and has your best interests at heart, and also knowing that he's helping to train a future leader. So I'm most appreciative of him, and appreciative to the society for having us work together here. We are colleagues, so we started off as a mentor and protege, and now we are colleagues here. He is a tremendous multitasker. He's not only been leader of the Bergen Society for decades, he also teaches at Columbia, and I'm not going to get into all of that. He's going to do that, and more importantly, he's going to ask the question and then answer it. Need humanism be reasonable? Joe Chuman.
Lovely and sweet introduction. Thanks so very much. I first met Anne, I think it was at the first AAU summer school back in 1996.
The second one.
Second one, 1998, right. And at that time, let me just say, if truth be told, she had her doubts about ethical culture, and I'm glad to see you resolve them. So, and resolve them in the best possible way. So thank you very much. It's always sustaining to have Anne here when I'm speaking, and especially to preside. I'm honored as well as sustained. And Jerry, thank you very much for your beautiful artistry as well. And I must say, the stars must have been positioned just right to have students from the Humanist Institute here this morning, because I'm going to be talking directly about humanism as I understand it from my position, and I assure you, I will offend. There you go. But I'm sure all humanists agree, whatever their stripe, that truth is not created by diktat. In effect, it comes as a result of disagreement, argument, and slowly accretes over time whatever truth there may be. Need humanism be reasonable? What I want to do is dedicate my address this morning to another colleague. That is, to the life and the memory of my esteemed colleague, our colleague, Dr. Matthew E. Spetter, who died last December at the age of 91. Let me just ask, how many people here knew Dr. Spetter? Just very good. Yeah, thank you. Dr. Spetter's formative experiences were shaped by the Second World War. East, as we used to call him, was born in the Netherlands, and during World War II was a liaison officer between sections of the Dutch and French undergrounds in Nazi-occupied Europe. He was caught by the Nazis, condemned to death, and was held captive at the Buchenwald and Auschwitz death camps. He escaped death and the gas chambers as a result of a clerical error the Nazis had made, and once freed, served as a witness at the Nuremberg trials before coming to the United States. In the US, Spetter discovered the ethical movement and worked as a leader intern at the Brooklyn Society with its then leader, Henry Newman. He then served for several decades as the leader of the Riverdale Yonkers Society for Ethical Culture, where he became best known to most of us, and indeed finished his career right here as a part-time leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture. East received his PhD from the New School, trained as a psychotherapist, and practiced psychotherapy during his long career. In 1960, he founded the Riverdale Mental Health Clinic, which still serves that community. He long taught ethics at the ethical culture schools, chaired the ethics department, and taught peace studies at Manhattan College in Riverdale. He, needless to say, lectured often and wrote several books, all of which were dedicated to expounding his philosophy of life. East was always a very formal man, a European man, who took life and ethical culture, to which he was wholeheartedly devoted, very seriously. And because he did take it seriously, many of us take it seriously as well. There is no doubt that Dr. Spetter's understanding of humanism and ethical culture was intimately shaped by and as a result of his personal life experience. To give you a taste of his humanism, I'd like to quote from the very beginning of his book, Man the Reluctant Brother. His opening words are rather harrowing. He wrote as follows: I need truth because I was an eyewitness to the premeditated murder of children. The killers were men and women of a nation much akin to my own. The children were ours. I need truth because my generation allowed the ultimately impermissible, and because such killing continues. Men everywhere, while protesting their abhorrence, are still willing to permit the impermissible, still willing to kill as, quote, a necessary evil, still willing to appease their conscience with justifications which fashion the tyranny of evil upon their souls. I need truth, and therefore behind the veil of language and the logic of argument of this book stands my personal urgency. If no one is willing to renounce the murder of children, how will we then be answerable for anything? The murder I witnessed was of the children of Europe during World War II, but many more murders have since been added. The killing was against children from France and Holland and Norway and Poland and Russia. They were of all religious backgrounds, though the children of defenseless minorities were the prime targets. Their very defenselessness fanned the ferocity of the killers. Some children were suffocated by gas. Some children were buried alive. Some children were torn to pieces by fragmentation or firebombs. Some children were given neither food nor water. All children were taken to be killed. Lame children and blind children, children in hospitals and children in the street coming home from school, children in light summer clothes, children who had gone for a swim. Yes, even children were taken who wept because they were afraid. I have seen this and speak of it, not with sentimentality, but with outrage, and I will not permit it to be locked from your heart. No doubt, my colleague, Dr. Stetter, did not have a very sunny view of the human condition. As a young man, he had witnessed and was a survivor of the darkest underside of human behavior. But he was by no means a defeatist nor fatalist. His commitment to humanism was forged out of that sense of the evil propensities of which human beings are capable. As he often said of ethical culture and of us, that our mission is to rescue the human from all those forces which seek to degrade it. Quote, whatever we do, I recall him saying to me quite often, quote, we must not hold human life nor ourselves cheaply. It is a lesson that has stayed with me ever since. Just as he begins his book with horror, so he ends it with a note of hope. He wrote, quote, I hold deeply that each life is a gift which the centuries bestow upon the continuity of his existence. A passio humana, a passion for man, is what will negate totalitarianism and oppression. It will open the jail doors of history, provided our mutuality and love outpace our tools. All of us are constantly close to death, and yet we are also in touch with the perpetuation of life through what we create and build. The sense of future derived from this position has resulted for me in an infusion of insight, which even at moments during my captivity, when death seemed certain and sealed, did not desert me. End quote. Spener philosophically, I believe, was a kind of existentialist, believing that we can and we must forge our lives and futures out of our experience and out of the best that lies within us. His writings and speeches are frequently sprinkled with references to the great humanist Albert Camus, who wrote movingly of the courage and greatness of the human being when confronted by adversity, and who has the ability for sacrifice and courage when life calls us to be courageous. He also quoted often from Martin Buber, who wrote poetically about the irreducibility of that humanity that lies within each of us. It was such ideas that framed Matthew Spetter's understanding of humanism. His humanism reached deeply and ranged widely across human experience. He saw the life of men and women lived out between good and evil, life and death, triumph and tragedy, courage and frailty, hope and despair, what the world is and what the world might be. And throughout, his mission was to inspire us to summon our agency and courage to fashion a world in which, again, the lives and humanity of women, men, and children would be esteemed and not held cheaply. His humanism was a richer and deeper humanism, and from my own humble perspective, I think that my venerable colleague got it right. I rest upon Spetter's humanism as a prelude to try to explain my understanding of humanism. And to do so, I want to focus on the cherished value of reason and the place of reason in a humanistic philosophy of life. I rest upon Spetter's, as there is little doubt, let me continue, in my mind, that Spetter was a rationalist, and so am I. What I mean by this is that I highly value reason and try to conduct my life by its guiding light. In the most intimate sense, I measure my beliefs by the test of reason. I tend to be what you might call an intellectual rigorist. In other words, I like to think of myself as adopting a belief as my own, only when it conforms to evidence and to the canons of reason. I want my beliefs to be proportionate to the facts, so to speak, and if a proposition contradicts the facts, the preponderance of evidence or rational consistency, then my inclination is to reject it. I affirm that there is no dignity in asserting what reason tells us is not true. When presented with a proposition that does not sound right to me, my first inclination is to say to my interlocutor, prove it, skeptic that I am. When I say that my beliefs need to pass these tests in order for me to accept them, I am not saying that I must personally and directly be witness to the facts and to the evidence that emerges from them. Most of us appropriately accept the beliefs of other people, credentialed and experienced scientists or other experts, for example, whose authority we trust and who indeed have subjected themselves to those tests. And this is the way it must be. Our lives must often rest upon second-hand authority, authority that we believe, again, also passes the tests of evidence and reason. I want not only my beliefs, but my choices in life to be guided by reason. Without reason, we flop around lost, guided only by our hunches, our intuitions, and our impulses. We need reason as a basis for living a good, productive, and again, dignified life. And we need reason for the sake of sustaining an orderly and civilized society. Mentioning science as I do, I note that science is the most powerful and productive application of reason that humankind has ever created. Science is the most reliable tool ever forged to grasp a handle on how reality is put together. And the application of science continues to phenomenally expand our understanding of the natural world and to transform the condition of society in ways that would have been just totally unimaginable to people just a few centuries ago. I am not a scientist, but I greatly esteem science and the power of the scientific methods. There's not only one scientific method. The method used by the chemist in the laboratory is not the method used by the deep space astronomer, but indeed I revere science as presented. If we had to point to a single enterprise that represents the success of the human species, it would be, I submit, the career of science and the application of science in creating the modern world. Imagine having a toothache in the year 932 and what that would be like. All those romantics who want to go back to a previous time, I have two words for you: chamber pot. Okay? And then think about science in their sense. Okay? Got it? Okay. Sometimes I tell my wife, oh, I can't stand the modern world, I want to go back to the 19th century, and then she very soberly reminds me what I would be up against, if I did. Okay. Sometimes in a romantic flourish. I think it is only, I should say, it is only a fool who dismisses the deliverance of scientific knowledge, and unfortunately today there are many such fools. And finally, I believe that reason can be elegant. I suspect that mathematicians, philosophers, and scientists know this well. When previously disassociated and confused ideas rationally pulled together, not only do they compellingly grip the mind, they also stimulate our aesthetic sensibilities. In short, ideas and ideas ordered by the template of reason can be beautiful. It is my commitment to reason and the test of evidence that long ago caused me to give up a belief in a divine custodian, a supernatural being who lords over us, cares for us, and judges us. I personally simply see no evidence, either moral evidence or empirical evidence, for such a being. It is the cherishing of reason and the salient place that it has in my life and character that leads me to identify myself as a rationalist. But, and here's the inflection point in my address, but I must say that having so declared myself myself. I do not equate humanism, as I understand it, with rationalism. To put it more pointedly, reason alone does not the humanist make. Or to state it more dryly, reason is a necessary but not sufficient condition to serve as the basis, exclusive basis, for humanism, or in my view, a humanist identity. To be candid, and here I get into opposition with some of our esteemed guests this morning, what leads me to deal with this topic is the recent emergence of a multitude of organizations that are known as rationalist, secular, or atheist groups. Some are very new, and some have been around a long while, but are experiencing a period of revitalization. All but the last, that is, the atheist cluster of groups, would identify themselves as humanist organizations, I believe. And since they so identify themselves as humanist, and so do we, it is easy for those inside ethical culture and outside of it to assume that these groups in ethical culture are indeed one and the same, and that they are virtually interchangeable with regard to their underlying and animating philosophies. Among the groups I have in mind, and there are others, are the American Humanist Association, which has been around since the 1930s, the Council for Secular Humanism, which publishes Free Inquirer magazine, the Secular Coalition, the Coalition of Reason, and others. And since many of these groups, for the moment, seem to be flourishing and are in the public eye, there is a natural tendency to move towards them, for ethical culture to move towards them. I do not count the Humanist Institute among them because, as I'll point out, that's a coalition, and I believe heartily in coalitions. Let me state, however, squarely that I do not personally accept this tendency of moving towards other rationalist groups and so on, regardless of how they call it. But I do have to be clear about where I stand. I wish these organizations very well. They do things I believe in and support. And I also firmly, as noted, believe in coalitions, and I think that ethical culture, especially since it is a very small organization, should seek to join coalitions with which we have important overlapping interests. Coalitions, by definition, are organizations that are set up for a single purpose or a small set of purposes, and are made up of organizations that may have very different philosophies and goals, but find common cause in this one project or purpose. When years ago I represented the ethical culture movement on the board of the National Coalition Against the Death Penalty, a coalition of many organizations, I was happy to sit at the same table with a representative of the Roman Catholic Church, an organization that shares my disdain for capital punishment, but with which I obviously share very little else. After all, it was to our advantage. He represented an organization of 60 million people, I an organization of 3,000. But when we sat at the board, on the board of the National Coalition, we both equally had one vote. That's why I think coalitions are smart for small organizations. It's a way to tag yourself on to a larger movement and instantly boost your empowerment, as it were, with regardless to the cause. Likewise, I should say, when the secular and rationalist groups I'm alluding to are fighting to protect the rights of secularists, or are defending the separation of church and state, or are trying to beat back the churches in their takeover of the public square, or legitimate the place of secularists and atheists in the fabric of American society, I am very happy to join in coalitions with them to fight for these concerns. These are things I deeply care about, some of them, particularly separation of church and state, militantly, and I have the bona fides to show it. But my willingness to join with such groups to support common projects does not, to my mind, suggest an identification with these organizations, because in significant ways I differ from them and have a very different view as to what humanism means. I simply do not, and here I'm speaking personally, and other people will have different views, obviously they do. I simply do not resonate with their music. Their dance is not a dance I do, but to be confessional, I don't do too much dancing. I may be an outlier in the ethical culture movement, and even among my beloved professional colleagues, in that I have to say I have never joined, nor have I ever been a member of an organization that calls itself humanist, other than ethical culture. This is my sole organizational identification, and ethical culture is where my exclusive loyalty lies and always has. I may occasionally attend the meetings of other such groups, and even write for their magazines and have many friends among them, and as I mentioned, am eager to work with other humanist groups towards common political goals and ends, but as an outsider, not as an insider. I have some important things in common with them, but enough wherein I don't personally feel a kinship to feel that I belong with other groups as a fellow member. And to proclaim a really big heresy, and for the sake of honest disclosure, I sometimes feel more comfortable, and here I'm speaking for myself, more comfortable and more at home among liberal clergy of traditional religions who root their ethics in ancient, venerable, and rich traditions than I do among the members of rationalist and secular groups whose agendas I often find limited and whose understanding of humanism I often find one-dimensional, dry, and in a certain sense, brittle. It is this that I need to explain at greater length because it really goes to the heart of my message this morning and what I understand ethical culture to be. First, I need to say that this address may seem to some to be an exemplification of, figure out how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, okay? Of course, my answer to that is it depends how big a pin you're talking about. And it may be an example of what Sigmund Freud brilliantly referred to as the narcissism of small differences. Freud is very out, but he was brilliant and sometimes came up with really brilliant insights and sights. And there is a sort of phenomenon called the narcissism of small differences. People very often are more preoccupied with showing their differences with regard to organizations that are close to them, rather than doing fierce battle with those that are far away and you can construe as their enemies and so on and so on. But I don't think that this is a case of the narcissism of small differences. I personally have been a professional in ethical culture, if I include my training, for what is now 44 years, which means it's beginning to feel like a profession. It is not a job, however, but a life-absorbing vocational commitment, which has long become part and parcel of who I am. It is with me and in me all the time. My humanism is something I live and breathe, and in that sense is near and dear to me and very deeply felt. It helps define where my center of gravity lies. It is something that I think about and reinforce constantly. And out of this lived commitment, I come to the conclusion and the conviction that humanism encompasses far more than reason or rationalism can contain. Here is what I mean. However essential reason is to my identity as a humanist, I recognize that reason, in the final analysis, is a tool. However glorious reason is, it remains a tool, an instrumentality, a means that enables us to achieve goals and interests that themselves transcend reason, and that reason, in effect, has little to do with. In other words, the nature of human beings, as I understand them, is such that the ultimate ends we seek are not themselves rational or reasonable. For whatever reasons or causes, some people simply cannot be happy unless they risk their lives scaling mountains or work endless hours to become prima ballerinas. Some find meaning in turning their bodies into living sculptures through hanging out at the gym and the extraordinary effort of lifting weights 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. Others find meaning by teaching others new skills or beating out the next guy on the stock market, by being entertainers or winning Scrabble competitions or balancing pie plates on their noses, or dedicating themselves to communicating to others ethical values and social ideals. Many others yearn to be parents and nurture children, and their lives would be diminished if they were childless. One of the most interesting things, I think, one of the most fascinating things about human beings, is the almost infinite variety of their values, goals, their dreams, and aspirations. And these things we yearn for most, I argue, do not emerge from reason. They come from the deepest recesses of our being, our hearts, if you will, and very often they emerge from us unbidden. We simply find meaning and purpose and our happiness for causes that are diverse and often totally arbitrary, just as we might prefer chocolate to pistachio. And reason may help us to achieve our aspirations and our wants. It certainly does. But reason is not their source. As the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer once said, quote, "I can do what I want, but I cannot want what I want." End quote. Our wants and desires arise in us from our inner depths, just as our impulses do. We are creatures of reason, to be sure, and reason is essential to life, and it ennobles us. but our humanity extends far more broadly than our reason does. We are also creatures of love and desire, compassion and aspiration, of devotion, of hate, of fear, of foibles and foolishness, of joy and sorrow, of courage and self-doubt, and we are creatures of irrationality too, and much, much more. There is much to life that reason cannot penetrate nor explain. There is irony and paradox, tragedy and contradiction, and even aspects of human experience that are mysterious and defy rational understanding. Out of these depths, both known and unknown to us, comes our creativity. The human impulse to create art and music, poetry, and to fulfill our infinite longings in the service of which we seek fulfillment and our need to put the stamp of meaning on our lives. This is all part of the human experience, and which a wider humanism, I argue, embraces, but a humanism reduced and conflated to rationalism alone does not. Another way to state this is that reason is cold. Reason does not provide warmth, it does not provide belonging, does not satisfy the need for love, friendship, family, charity, sympathy, devotion, sanctity, or forgiveness. But my point is that my understanding of humanism, as I understand it, does. The Roman playwright Terence, in what's written, quote, "I am a human being, therefore nothing human is alien to me," end quote. The infinite varieties of human experience, I think, should be a source of curiosity and interest for us. The secularist and rationalist groups, as I see them, and I've been around a long time, tend to be anti-religious, condemning the religions on the grounds that so many of the beliefs and doctrines of the traditional faiths are patently irrational. Indeed, the very idea of faith as a justification for holding beliefs that are counter-rational is itself irrational. There is, of course, from my point of view, much that is very valid in this critique, and that I agree with, and its validity, and I agree with its validity as far as it goes. And much evil, believe me, much evil is perpetrated in the name of religion, to be sure. And let me just state parenthetically, one imposing question that I entertain as a sort of proponent and advocate of human rights is what role the new Pope, whose ascension is reported with such saccharine goodness and light, what role he really played in Argentina's dirty war. Okay, I think that's something that has not been looked at deeply enough. Okay, a dirty war in which vast swaths of the Catholic Church had complicity with fascism, murder, torture, and repression, as the Church ignominiously did under the Franco regime in Spain and in many other places. I am not naive. Believe me, I'm the last person to be naive to the evil done in the name of religion, or when religion especially is conjoined with political force and political power. Okay? There's a lot to critique in the world of religion, and religion is not an innocent bystander or actor by many means in the perpetration of much, but not all, of the evil that we see. I'm not naive to that. But I would argue there is another side. If religion is a human creation, and I believe it is, and I think the position of most humanists is that it's a human creation, then it is also a human expression, just as art and music are human expressions. And like art and music, is very widespread and has given birth to traditions that are both ancient and very complex, and in their own ways can be highly sophisticated. Look at, India and Hinduism is a tradition like Greece that produced a bona fide philosophical tradition. Much of Hinduism is highly intellectualized, very philosophical, and very complex. And to simply dismiss it as the irrationality of religion, I think itself is anti-intellectual and foolish. To give you one example, but there are many examples in many traditional faiths. Religion can also be, I would argue, and is a quest for ultimate meaning, and therefore its significance therefore should not be alien to us. If this is the case, then it seems that religion should at least be an object of curiosity and fascination as a human expression, rather than basically subjected to wholesale rejection. And we can see aspects of religion, therefore, I believe, within the humanist frame, and not exclusively as humanism's enemy. Let me bring this talk right up to the moment with an anecdote about curiosity and fascination with religion. There is a fascinating op-ed editorial in the weekly review of today's New York Times, written by a guy who has done study, he's a secularist, a study into Christian evangelicals and what in the world is really going on. What is really going on when they say they have a personal rapport with God, okay? And this short op-ed piece deals with the question of how evangelicals relate to their God, in very personal terms, obviously, when they suffer great tragedy. And the conclusion that he reaches is that they don't indeed see this in theological terms. I would see it in theological terms. I want to know why it is that a omnipotent and perfectly good God permits the innocent to suffer. Why do bad things happen to good people? That's called the question of theodicy or the problem of evil. He says evangelicals don't entertain God in that way. They entertain God in a functional sense. They talk to God and see God as a type of virtually, as he puts it, a benign sort of psychotherapist who engages them in a version of rational emotive therapy. Rational emotive therapy is the notion that the reason we have negative emotions is because those negative emotions are basically pegged to wrong and bad ideas. And we can get beyond our negative emotions if we correct our thinking, okay? Rational emotive therapy. I find that fascinating. You know why? Because the grandfather, the father, basically, the creator of rational emotive therapy was none other than Albert Ellis, whose institute is on the east side, East 65th Street, and Albert Ellis was an identified humanist. So if we want to find humanism even in strange places, you can now find it in Rick Warren's Saddlebrook Church, a megachurch in California, which this guy used as the study. The point is that I'm making should be clear that abject dismissal, okay, in the name of a rationalistic humanism that puts rationality and rational consistency as the only criteria by which to indeed embrace human experience, leaves out, okay, dimensions of human experience that we might, in a sense, applaud. And maybe what we ought to do here, and maybe the time is right, just right, using that as a point of entry, to have a humanist evangelical dialogue, okay, right, in that regard, about, you know what I'm saying? It would be an interesting venture to undertake, because we now, I would argue the evangelicals who have given up on hell and brimstone, nobody likes hell these days, okay, indeed have embraced very often a type of pop psychology. That's what I'm talking about. And you could argue that there's a humanistic, therefore a humanistic trend, okay, even within churches that we might at first blush want to readily dismiss. There's more there than meets the eye. Reality is more complex than we initially think it to be. Anyway, to bring this to an end, a wider humanism, I think, can even understand the irrational as a human expression. The Greek tragedians certainly understood the suffering of tragic figures who were victimized by their own fatal flaws, which were as much a part of their humanity as their vaunted capacity for reason. And out of their irrational actions, Antigone, Oedipus, Agamemnon, take who you choose, generated by their tragic flaws, the ancient playwrights, of course, created great art, which speaks to our common humanity over a gulf of more than 2,000 years. I am by no means saying that we should embrace beliefs, religious or otherwise, that our reason tells us are not true. We can reject them and refute them, and we should. Only that we appreciate those beliefs as human expressions that in their exploration broaden and enrich our own sense of the human experience and what it means to be a human being. My message by now should be clear. Need humanism be reasonable? I say yes, absolutely, but it need be much more. I think that a humanism that identifies humanism merely with the rational is flat, one-dimensional, and from my own point of view, badly impoverished. It may be the reason why so many, I'm sorry I'm critical again, of these rational and secular groups appear to me at least to be overly intellectualistic, have a very thin communal life, if they do at all, and barely appreciate the humanity of association that embraces families and children. I think they're also, and here I'll be a little stronger in my critique, they're also politically quietistic for the most part. In their overemphasis in winnowing the human experience to its rational core, and their aversion to anything that does not meet the test of reason, these groups seem to me not at all different in that regard from the practices of religious devotees who are overly fastidious with the purity of doctrine, that is, those groups that they would otherwise and do in fact readily condemn. My humanism, and specifically ethical culture, which is not focused primarily on reason, but on the humanity that dwells within each of us, potentially, I believe, allows for a wider appreciation of the human expression in all its multidimensionality and its myriad forms and expressions. Moreover, our commitment to deed above creed keeps our sights away from picayune arguments about belief, rational and otherwise, and more focused on alleviating human suffering in concrete ways. Ethical culture thereby keeps us focused on interpersonal engagement and action in ways in which I believe many of these other associations, in my view, don't quite do. In closing, I personally seek a humanism that is sensitive to human experience in its multiple manifestations, that is moved not only by reason, but by matters of the heart that reason does not reach. I want a humanism that honors reason, but is also moved by compassion and love. I want a humanism that rejoices in the triumphs of human beings, but also embraces the human being, knowing his frailties and imperfections. I want a humanism that can respect the achievements of great men and women, but is no less moved by the precious and ineffable humanity we encounter when we look upon the face of a child.